This is the China Grand Strategy Simulation Briefing. This is a simulation of great power politics in East Asia. It has scenarios from the current interaction of the great powers, and it's got scenarios that go out as late as 2080. The purpose is to examine the operation of the great powers and their interests in a complex environment, and to see whether certain balance of power interactions occur. There are 19 different states in the simulation, and each is played between 5 or as down as few as 3 players per state. The essential structure for each country is you have a political leader, and this political leader may never see the simulation map, and they may not encounter members of other countries. They're simply there to manage their own cabinet members, which typically include a foreign minister and their military commanders. The foreign minister communicates with the military leader, their political leader, and they can interact with the foreign ministers of other states, and they're largely responsible for treaties and economic relations. The military commander must implement the policy of the political leader. They can interact with other military leaders of allied powers if it's authorized in writing by the political leaders. So essentially, you've got a stovepiped interaction. The military leader can see the map. The military leader then is to communicate what's happening on the map, give feedback to the political leader, who then manages that information from the military leader and the foreign minister player into their strategy, and then makes decisions based upon that. So the simulation captures not only the strategic interaction, but also the peculiarities of domestic decision making, which I think is very important for any simulation. Each of the players has a card which details victory points and how they maximize victory points, which are then used to determine which state is the victor in the simulation, which state got the most victory points. And at the end, I'll show you how that is determined. The simulation also contains a long list of minor countries that are not played, but they can be controlled as allies. They can be subject to diplomacy roles where their allegiance is shifted from neutrality to ally, and they can be traded with. The values in this particular file show a state, a letter, which refers to an export type, that'll be elaborated later, that's a part of the economic model for the simulation, a catastrophe value, which is essentially a measure of the damage done from a nuclear exchange, and it essentially measures 50% loss of the state, and then a collapse value, which is when that number is attained by the numbers of megadead, then the state collapses militarily and economically, and those will be elaborated later. States can also be characterized by the size of their economy, and again by their trade type, and by which state is allied with them. And so from this chart you can see Armenia is allied to Russia, Bangladesh is allied to China, Bhutan is allied to India, and so forth. And these give privileges, both physical in the simulation map and for commercial purposes and victory point purposes for the different players at the end of the simulation. So this is the simulation map. Each hex is approximately 200 kilometers across. Each turn is 2 weeks. China's prominently displayed at the center. Its geography somewhat exaggerated since the simulation centers on Chinese interests. There is a large representation of Siberia and the Pacific. One of the objectives was to put as much detail in the map as possible as regards strategic interests, geographic goals, economic goals such as mines, oil fields, infrastructure. This is an overlay done by one of my students, which shows areas of interest for China strategically that garner China victory points. In other words, these are territories that China would like to take over, or rather reclaim, either as possessions, but territories China believes they lost during the century of humiliation in the 19th century. These are the playing pieces for the contemporary scenario, color-coded for each state. Some states share colors, simply because there were not enough colors, but they're geographically distanced from each other, so you're not going to have confusion. The essential symbols are a rectangle, which indicates an army, a circle with a dot in center indicates a fleet, triple X's on top of a box indicate a corps-sized formation of 50,000 plus soldiers and equipment. For the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, on the top left, the orange units, you can see the army designation in the box. These have probably changed. Some units have a T next to their number, and that indicates territoriality, which means those units may not leave their home territory. They're essentially reserves. The exception are territorial units of North and South Korea, which may enter into each other's territory, because from their perspective, it's the same country. The single-digit number is the number that must be rolled equal to or less than in order to, for the purposes of naval warfare, destroy an enemy ship, or for the purposes of land warfare, push another unit in the direction desired by the attacker. So it's a very simplified combat system. The back of the counters contain no additional information, and the names on the counters indicate which countries these counters are located. Not every country has a military unit. In addition, if you look at the bottom left, you'll see a reinforcement chart. Those are the American and Russian units that come on turn 2. Then on the American and NATO units that come on turn 4 and 5. And then American and NATO units that come on turn 8. Other than that, there are no further reinforcements in the simulation. So this is the consolidated reinforcement chart. The issue here is that victory points are deducted from the victory point total. They're essentially costs, opportunity costs of units being located to East Asia, because they're being removed from other parts of the world where they're required. So there are costs when there's a scarcity of military capability and there's a concentration in one particular theater. So here's some of the detail I wanted you to see in the map. You can see the blue is the ocean. Areas surrounded in orange are areas of interest that are specified in the rules. Red circles with blue dots are cities that have victory point consequences. You can see red lines with rails on them. Those are infrastructure, road and rail. Green refers to the interior of China. Inverted V's are mountains. Thick black shapes with white in the center are islands. Orange, what look like, not orange rather, pink towers are oil fields. And you could see a red dashed sort of ridges on blue hexags, and those indicate the different Chinese island chains, which are important for victory point determination. There are other terrain features I will show when we get to the appropriate picture. So, but here you can see the Senkaku Islands, Ishigaki, the Chungqiao Field, which is a dispute between Japan and China. You can see the East China Sea and Iedo, which is a dispute between South Korea and East China Sea. So there's a fair bit of detail in the map. Here you can see the South China Sea with possessions by the different states. This is the Pacific. The atolls are becoming strategically more important. It was a surprise to me that in the early 2000s, China had a listening post for American ballistic missile testing on Tarawa, which coincidentally was the first island that the U.S. assaulted amphibiously during the Second World War. So islands becoming repurposed from old strategic competitions to new strategic competitions. In the top left of the map, you can see the dashed line of the second island chain, which again has an impact on Chinese strategic goals. Here you can see Southeast Asia. There's, of course, an intense competition going on in the region itself. Now, on the map, you can see in the top center red circles with asterisks inside them. Those are designated missile bases in China, and they're associated with a base number. You can also see along some of the rivers, like the Salween and the Mekong, 3 lines that cut across the river. You can also see it on the extreme left on the Brahmaputra. These indicate locations where dams may be built, and these have consequences both strategic and economic. You can also see boxes that are orange that look like little gift boxes. They've got a plus sign inside them, and those are mineralogical sites. Here you can see the Himalayan frontier between India and China, and India's border with Pakistan. Here you can see Central Asia and the location of the different oil fields, as well as the Russian nuclear weapons bases, places like Alaysk, Uzur, and Ufa. Here you can see the Persian Gulf, which is vitally important to both China, India, and many other states, and the competition that surrounds this area as well. I want to make one mention of another feature. As you look at the bottom center near Dhahran on the coast of Saudi Arabia in the Persian Gulf, you'll see a blue circle with a green inset. That is an area of ethnic descent. And so some hexes are designated for that, and the rule will be explained later, but it permits states to interfere in other states' domestic politics by inciting ethnic unrest. Here you can see the Russian Far East, which plays an important role in one of the simulations, one of the scenarios in the future. So I'd like to go through a very rough brief about how the combat works. The turns occur consecutively. China moves first, then the US, and other players can either choose sides and go with China or the US, or they would go in a third turn collectively. But there's a certain sequence. Typically the larger states are allowed to go first and then the weaker states. So in Southeast Asia, if there's a regional confrontation, typically Vietnam would go before Thailand because it has a larger military, or India would go before Pakistan. And so the game sort of has that ad hoc ordering of players, which is handled by the referee, and that whole process takes about 5 minutes once the students are reasonably familiar with the process. Individual ground units can move 1 hex per turn, but if they're on a rail network, they can move 40 hexes per turn. Ships can move 60 hexes per turn. Now, ships can move into a hex with an enemy ship or an enemy ground unit, and that's how they do combat. Ground units typically can't move into the hex of another state or an opposing state. So you would move that unit adjacent and then conduct an attack. Now, when the attack is conducted and it's successful, the attacker can then retreat the defender piece into the area which it chooses, into the hex, the adjacent hex that it chooses. Now, there is an exception. Stacking is unlimited. You can have as many ships and as many armies on 1 hex. You could put all the armies and all the ships on 1 hex if so desired. So there are instances where you'll have 2 stacks of pieces, and the stack of attacking pieces, 1 or 2 of the pieces manages to put out the opposing piece, and so they'll advance into the enemy stack. And so you'll have a stack with a bunch of friendly units and a bunch of enemy units, and in that instance, the units that are mixed in that stack can only fight amongst each other. They can't fight outside of that stack. And so you end up with a very long conflict in which the pieces are pushing back against each other. So now the combat is conducted with a very, very simple formula. You take the number, let's say, of the naval craft, you subtract from it the value of the opposing naval craft, which is then halved and rounded down if it's an odd number. And then the attacker has to roll that number or less to kill the naval unit, or that number or less to push the ground unit 1 hex, to force it to retreat 1 hex. So that's the essential attack. Now, if a country is using tactical nuclear weapons, which the Russians and Americans can do in the contemporary scenario, and many countries can do in the future scenario, then the attacker gets to roll twice and chooses the more favorable value. And typically this is done by a random number generator on a calculator. And in the defense, the country with using tactical nuclear weapons subtracts their full value and not simply half of their value rounded down. A rolling of a number 10 is always a failure, and rolling a number 1 is always a success. So the modifiers, even if they put a state into the negatives, the state still retains at least 1 on 10 or a 10% chance of achieving its goal. Now, there are terrain effects to the rolls. If the defender is in a mountain, if there's an amphibious attack, there's a -2. So if you have a unit on a ship and it's landing against a hex with units on it, there's a -2 to the roll. There is a naval support. Ships can provide a +1 to attackers if they're attacking onto a hex, and the naval craft makes its roll. Now, in coastal operations, there's always a danger that defenders can fire a missile at ships. So whenever ships move into a hex they don't control that is adversarial, the entire stack gets attacked by a 1. So the defender would roll a 1, and if they rolled any other number, there'd be no effect. But if they rolled a 1, one of the ships would be destroyed. This doesn't apply if there are soldiers that were previously landed that were friendly in the enemy territory, as could occur with Chinese soldiers, for example, airborne soldiers landing on Taiwan. It wouldn't apply if the ship was taking over an oil rig at sea, for example. So the exceptions are listed in the rules. Now, navies become much weaker when they're farther than 5 hexes from a city, because navies have integral air support from ground-based air assets. Maritime reconnaissance aircraft, bombers that can hit ships at sea. So if a country's ships are more than 5 hexes from a friendly city, which basically represent air bases, then they have a -3 modifier to their attack value. The Americans, the Russians, and NATO only have a -1 because of their aircraft carriers. China eventually will also get that benefit of only a -1, but not yet. China has a special capacity. Both the Americans and the Chinese may conduct amphibious attacks, and all countries can do transport of soldiers, where an individual ship will pick up a ground unit and move it 40 hexes across the map and then land it on a beach somewhere. To do that, the ground unit has to begin that turn in a city, which is a port, and not move. Right? All cities that are on the coast are ports. So all countries can do amphibious landings in that sense, and can do transportation in that sense. What the Chinese have that is special is for an attack on Taiwan, they have their normal 1 amphibious operation per turn that they conduct with their vessels. In addition to that, they can drop 1 airborne unit onto an adjacent hex, in effect from China to Taiwan. And in addition to that, they may do 1 amphibious attack against a hex that's adjacent. And that amphibious attack has 2 ground units launched from 1 ship. So these amphibious operations do require ships, but China's got a 2-in-1, which is unique to China. So in 1 turn, China can land a maximum of 3 amphibious ground units and 1 airborne unit onto Taiwan. But for amphibious landings to occur, there must be no enemy naval craft in that hex. So the Chinese must have wiped out the Republic of China Taiwan fleet before they're to land. Now, it is also possible for countries to create blockades. To do that, for example, if the U.S. Navy were to blockade China, they would have to have a ship that would make contact with a piece of territory, not necessarily China itself, but a piece of territory that would be the area within which Chinese ships would go if they're bringing in oil or trading with third parties with which there is no terrestrial contiguity, a country, let's say, like Saudi Arabia, and then it would move across the map and make contact with another piece of territory. And if China could not get around that water, let's say an American ship made contact with South Korea, and then it moved across the map, made contact with Vietnam, a blockade would be established. And for China to break the blockade, they would simply have to pass through that barrier, and then the blockade is broken. So there's incentive for the fleets to meet each other and to reduce each other. So for India to blockade Pakistan, they could move a ship to the Iranian coast or even the Pakistani coast, move it across the map to Gujarat in India, and then Pakistan would be isolated until they broke the link. Now, if ever a country that produces oil is conquered, the conqueror can only extract 50% of the oil, rounded down, that the country was originally producing. So there are limits to conquest. This is not the 18th century or 19th century. There are big limits to conquering because of the importance of liberalism. The idea that it's illegitimate to conquer or colonize or make territorial changes when you conquer other people, as well as the role of nationalism and social mobilization that makes occupation rather expensive. So there are nuclear weapons in the simulation. There's 2 kinds of weapons, fission and fusion weapons. Fusion weapons have twice the effect. It's specified in the rule in the particular scenario what kind of systems countries have. China, the U.S., Russia, and NATO, representing England and France, they have fusion weapons in the contemporary scenario, where India, Pakistan, North Korea don't. They have fission weapons. Because each turn represents 2 weeks, in a given turn, if one side begins to launch nuclear weapons, you have a volley situation where one side, essentially a tennis game of nuclear retaliation, and you can have up to 7 volleys, where one side will fire nuclear weapons, the other side will respond, and that'll consist of 1 volley. And there's a form that I will show you in a moment of how to write that up, because it's got to be done in writing. You can't simply announce that you're launching a nuclear weapon and have it take effect. Now, countries can attack each other's ballistic missile submarines, the SSBNs, and to do that, a naval unit must be moved into that ballistic missile submarine's bastion, and different countries have different bastions. The Russians have the Sea of Okhotsk. The People's Republic of China uses the South China Sea. So India rather uses the Bay of Bengal. You put a naval craft into that region, and then if you can roll less than or equal to the attack value of that fleet, then the ballistic missile submarine is destroyed. Ballistic missile submarines are not represented by counters. They're abstracted, and their capacity that's listed on a player's power chart. Now, when a country has catastrophic losses, it loses 50% of its trade capacity, and 50% of its ground units are removed, the choice of the owner. When a country has 100% loss, in other words, the number of nuclear weapons detonated are equal to the collapse value, or half as many fusion weapons are detonated, then the country goes into complete collapse and loses all trade. All of its ground units are removed, and it can no longer export any oil. So these represent a mixture of civil defense, the total population of the country, the ability of the government to organize a response to a counter-value attack. So nuclear weapons are fired at cities. It causes the society to collapse. And so states have varying values. I generally estimated that China is disproportionately unorganized and therefore it's easier to disrupt China in a counter-value conflict than it would be, say, the U.S. The U.S. could probably survive politically in a much more highly decentralized state than China could. Different countries have different catastrophic loss and collapse values, and these have to be consulted. An important note is, even though the population and the economy are in utter chaos, and there's a significant disruption to the population, it doesn't affect the command and control of nuclear weapons. So China and the US and Russia can continue to use nuclear weapons long after their cities have been destroyed and a huge part of their population has been destroyed. Now, counterforce strikes are the use of nuclear weapons against other types of nuclear weapons. Here you can see the modifiers. The Americans have +2, Russia +1, and so forth. The values there are the base modified by the country modifier. So the base is specified in the rules. Here I've only got the value specific to that country. So what does that mean? It means for the Americans to destroy a missile in an enemy base, whether it's China or Russia, when they conduct a launch, they would have to roll a 10 or less on a 10-sided die or a number generator in order to destroy the target. In other words, the Americans have a 100% chance of destroying based nuclear weapons in opposing countries. To destroy air units, they would have a 90%, silos 80%. And where there's a base and a silo, if it's not specified as silo, in other words, a hardened underground facility, then it's a base, not a silo. Road mobile is 3, rail mobile is 3, or a submarine based is 2. Now the submarine base, to resolve this, it would have to be the prior rule I mentioned to you. This is an optional rule for attacking a state in a surprise attack when the submarines are still in port, and that can only occur if the very first volley is conducted by the attacker. So you can see the lower values for Russia, the lower values for China, and then India and Pakistan. So India and Pakistan have no chance of targeting road mobile or rail mobile systems. They simply don't have the command and control. And as I'll show you on the cards, missiles have to be able to reach the target. And in this simulation, there's no missile defense. Missile defense can intercept a handful of weapons, but the scale of the number of missiles in the simulation is so great, a missile defense system would have no substantive effect. So on the map, there are edges which indicate how many more hexes a missile must go to be able to reach a target, whether North or South America, Europe, parts of Africa. This is the PSYOP form. PSYOP is a single integrated operating plan. So you'd have to specify the state, the system it's using, how many warheads, which kind of warhead, the total, where it's firing from, where it's firing to, the total distance between the two, whether it's counter value or counter force. Counter value is, of course, hitting cities. Counter force is targeting the opponent's weapon system. And if it's counter force, what the target is, what the national probability is, and how many weapons you would expect to remain, and then it would be brought to the referee, and it's very, very easy to calculate each of the strikes. So players are encouraged to have PSYOPs, or basically computerized missile plans, in their back pocket, tailored for different kinds of contingencies, and they can just pull it out and give it to the referee to resolve. And this stuff resolves itself quite quickly. Now, every time a country conducts an attack outside of its territory with ground forces, not naval forces, that country incurs a cost of 0.1 victory point. So war costs money. It's expensive. Countries may influence the minor countries that I showed you earlier. Countries accumulate foreign aid points, and the richer countries have more foreign aid points. To influence a smaller country, the influencing country would choose to spend 1 or 2 foreign aid points. Now, what's not fairly represented is that these foreign aid points affect a tiny country as much as a very large country. So Micronesia has the same reaction to an influence attempt as a very large country like Nigeria. So the influencer would have to roll equal to or less than the number of points on a d10 with the following modifiers. It's +1 if it's a neighbor, -1 if there was a dispute, -1 if there are dam effects. In other words, the influencer has built a dam that has alienated the downstream state. +3 if the influencer is an oil exporter like Russia. +1 if there are trade benefits. If the influence attempt is successful, the larger state must provide market access for all of the goods of the minor state. So there's sort of obligations. If ever, during the simulation, the bigger state attacked the minor state, then an influence is not possible. And influencing will move a minor state from being an ally of another state in one step to neutrality, and then in another step from a neutral state to an ally of this country. So there can be a lot of points applied, and it's for the referee to disentangle it as major powers apply foreign aid to try to influence a country. Now, if ever a minor state that's an ally that a major power is trading with is somehow converted and turned into a neutral and brought under the aegis of another great power, the new great power cannot cancel more than 50% of the trade. So the half of the trade with the previous power remains. Now, one of the benefits of having allies? Well, there's victory points, of course, and the major power may traverse the minor power both with trade. And for example, if there's a landlocked country, it could bring trade through the minor country, and it could traverse it with military forces. Now, ethnic agitation is possible. There's unstable areas that are listed on the map, and some that are listed in the rules. Some are associated with specific hexes. So just to name off a few that you can see here, there's Tibet, East Turkestan, which is Uyghuristan, Aceh, the Karen, the Kachin, the Assamese, Kashmir, Balochistan, the Shiites and Sunnis in Pakistan, Yunnan minorities, and so on and so on. So a state may qualify to be able to incite ethnic agitation. Ethnic agitation normally requires some sympathetic sharing of identity. So it's easier for Kazakhstan, say, to incite the Turks inside China than for NATO. NATO is simply not allowed. So there are 3 levels of incitement. There's level 1, 2, and 3. Each with a different victory point lost, and these can be chosen. The maximum that can be inflicted on a country from ethnic agitation is 10 victory points for a specific ethnic group, and any attempted ethnic agitation is reduced to level 1 if the target country deploys a military unit into that hex or into the region. And so in effect, that's a suppression. Now there's a very large trade model that I'm going to elaborate later, because you really have to see it graphically. It's quite complex, and it runs parallel to the whole strategic model. So these are the rules for ethnic agitation. For it to occur, the influencing state must be adjacent or have coastal access. So you do have the phenomenon in the South China Sea of the different fishing communities shooting at each other with small arms, like Vietnamese and Filipinos and Chinese and Malay shooting at each other, and so that's not directly ethnic agitation, but it has many of the same characteristics, and so there's not a specific location for ethnic agitation in the South China Sea. It can just be sort of generically inflicted. And there are additional rules here. The agitated state can request the source of the agitation. They can demand it. Right, here's a much larger list of sites. There are some that are also specific not to identities, but to political systems and ideologies. So only democracies, for example, can agitate in Hong Kong. Taiwan may agitate against China via the Falun Dafa Gong. Only Iran may incite Shiite agitation. So there are sometimes limitations on who can incite who. For example, only India may incite the ethnic Indian minority in Fiji. So these are some of the generic awards that come at the end. So these are, you keep these in mind as the executive is searching for different strategies to achieve their foreign policy. I'm going to elaborate on this later on for the trade model, but there's one victory point per preferential trade, foreign aid. So major powers can receive foreign aid from other major powers and benefit from it. There's 3 victory points per conquered or allied minor state anywhere on the map, but there are limitations to who can conquer who. The liberal democracies like NATO and the US and Australia can't go conquering other liberal democracies. There's 2 victory points per oil derrick, a mineral mine, a dam, and city captured. So you do get points for capturing these, as long, again, as you're not a liberal democracy. Although liberal democracies may conquer non-liberal democracies and get points for it. There are generic victory point penalties, -1 victory point if any oil shortage occurs in a given turn. So countries have to put a lot of emphasis on making sure the oil source is providing the oil, and there's no blockade. A -2 victory point per received counter-value nuclear strike, so getting nuked with a fission weapon, that's -4 if it's a fusion weapon. -0.25 victory points per received counterforce nuclear strike. So if you're blowing up enemy silos in the ground, you're still throwing up fallout that has significant effects on the local population. -2 victory points per city captured by an adversary. -1 victory point per hex captured by an adversary. So this is just an empty hex in a country. So every hex matters. -0.1 victory point per ground unit making attacks outside the country. Those are the costs of war. -0.5 victory point per preferential trade awarded to another state. I will illustrate that later on. -1 victory point per hex of non-allied state on a state's border. So countries get penalties if they have a country on their border, whether a major power or a minor power, that is allied to another country. 0 is good for is the penalty for neutral states. So you want to have a sphere of influence around your country. You want to make sure that you're surrounded either by neutral states or friendly states. Oil exporting states lose 1 victory point per turn per oil point that is not exported to a customer. Sounds like a peculiarly harsh effect, but countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia depend very heavily on oil exports. There are significant implications for regime stability. So there's a strong incentive for them to make sure that they're not hoarding oil, but selling it. So here you can see the layout of the contemporary scenario of India and Pakistan. You can also see Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and Sri Lanka here. You can see the units with T on them. Those are territorial units. They cannot leave the contiguous territory of the country. And you can see the pieces in both Pakistan and India that are non-territorial. Minor countries normally can't have their forces leaving their territory. So Afghanistan, it doesn't have a T, but it's implied along with Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, as these are minor countries. Their units may not leave their home territory, even if they're controlled as allies by the major players. You can also see the Indian fleet opposite the Pakistani fleet in the Arabian Sea. So if there was to be an attack conducted here, the 3 Indian units, which can move 40 hexes per turn, would simply be picked up and put on top of the Pakistani unit, and the Indians would attack. And in this particular attack, Pakistan would not respond. So this is a very simplified system where the attacker has significant benefits. So the Indian forces would be attacking with a value of 5. Minus half of the Pakistani value of 4, which is 2. So India would have 3 chances to roll 3 or less to destroy Pakistan's ship. So surprise definitely has a big impact in naval warfare here. For ground combat, we can look at the border between India and Pakistan starting in the south. You see a number of Indian units with 4T. Those are territorial units. They cannot attack into Pakistan. But if you look farther north along the border, you can see there are a number of Indian units with 5s. And we could, just one scenario for attack, there are 3 hexes in India with 2 Indian units on them with valued 5, and they all make contact with 1 hex with 1 Pakistani 5 valued unit. So you could have those 6 units attacking that Pakistani unit. It would be the Indian attack units would be valued at 5, minus half of the Pakistani unit, which is 50% of that is 2 rounded down. So it'd be 5 minus 2. So India would have 6 chances to roll 3 or less. and they would then choose in which direction Pakistan's retreating unit would go. It could go to any of the 3 hexes, and then India could advance into the hex with as many units as they want. That's essentially how the ground combat works. And then Pakistan, in its turn, if it survived the naval attack, it could attack back. And its ground forces could attack back with, again, the limitation that territorial forces in Pakistan cannot attack into India. So it's, again, a very simple combat system. Units that go along the rails that you can see there in Tibet. I've got there one piece of rail that shows how China's built a new infrastructure that reaches all the way to Lhasa. Countries can move almost, with regards to China, almost instantaneously across the country on the infrastructure. Railroads really are useful for moving Russian forces across the map very, very quickly. This is the South China Sea, and you can see Taiwan on the middle right, opposite China. I've put here the entire Chinese fleet and the very large Chinese army, and I've put the Taiwanese army and their fleet. And so any Chinese attack on Taiwan would have to begin with the very large Chinese fleet attacking the single Taiwanese fleet, because that fleet would have to be destroyed if the Chinese were to do any amphibious operations. But in the turn in which the Chinese attacked the Taiwanese, the Chinese could put 1 airborne soldier on top of Taiwan. Now, in the subsequent turn, assuming that the Taiwanese fleet is gone, the Chinese could then land 3 ground units per turn, 1 from one ship, 2 from another ship. Those are the special amphibious rules for China, plus a 4th would be an airborne unit. So they could land 4 units a turn, and they could try to overwhelm the defense. China looks like it's extremely strong. It has the most pieces in the game in terms of ground forces, and a fairly large navy, but it has to be qualified that they face a reasonably strong Taiwan, a dangerous situation in Korea, where you've got very large forces in both North and South Korea. You've got Russian forces in the Far East, a large Indian force on their Himalayan frontier, and a fairly strong Vietnamese force on their frontier. And China's got issues with Kazakhstan as well, and Central Asian states. So China's got a lot of interests, a fairly large force, but actually it's got the minimum, the bare minimum of forces necessary to manage a very challenging security environment, because of its common frontier with a great many very strategic regions. This is the Korean Peninsula. You can see the purple forces in the north, the DPRK, and the ERK in the south. All of these units typically are set up on 1 hex. The North Koreans around Pyongyang and the South Koreans at Seoul. They've each got 1 ship. And here you can see the principle I mentioned earlier of units attacking each other and then ending up on the same hex. So if South Korea were to attack into North Korea, which is difficult because you can see the mountainous terrain there, so there'd be a -2. And if any South Korean unit managed to push into North Korea, then the North Korean unit they pushed against would be then would be retreated into Hamhung, which is the farther north hex in North Korea. And that unit in Hamhung in subsequent turns couldn't simply move back on Pyongyang because there was a South Korean unit there. It would have to fight its way. And so over time you'd have, if the South Koreans were lucky, more and more South Korean units on Pyongyang and fewer North Korean units on Pyongyang, and they'd be pushed out to Hamhung. If ever a unit is forced to retreat out of its territory, and it was into unfriendly territory, the unit would be eliminated. If ever units were forced to retreat out of their territory so that the country lost all of its cities, then once it loses all of its cities, all of its military forces and ships are eliminated from the game. Essentially, it's conquered. But if it retreats into a neighboring territory that's friendly and it hasn't lost all its cities, because it's got one of its own cities perhaps somewhere else, then it can retreat into the friendly territory. Now, dams are an important aspect, not super important, but they have a cumulative effect on victory points. States can dam rivers to generate energy, but it can reduce river flows to downstream states. A state can choose to dam a river from 1 to 5 victory points, and so the country gets that many victory points. And it depends on the river. It's specified in the rules. Dams can be dismantled if the entire river system is seized. China has a choice. It can dam the Mekong River between 1 and 5, but the downstream states, Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, have negative effects. And there's a range listed for the Salween, the Irrawaddy, and of course India can inflict the same issue onto Pakistan with the Indus. It takes quite a few turns to build a dam, which is at least a year. And it's equivalent of a territorial dispute. The downstream state suffers the negative victory point effect. So it's quite severe. In effect, by building a very large dam for the Indus River or for India, it cuts off water to Pakistan, and it'd be almost certainly a casus belli because of the huge impact of having water cut off. Now, for any purpose, states can voluntarily submit to verification to determine with certainty whether a state has initiated a nuclear weapons program. In the contemporary scenario, South Korea and Japan can develop a nuclear weapons program. And so there's a lot of interest in many states to do verification. So this is an option. It's got to be done in writing, and then it allows the referee then to police any secret notes about clandestine nuclear weapons programs that the students initiate. And here there's a little mention here about the PSYOP document. There's a disarmament peace dividend. Any state may get rid of one of its units for 3 victory points. There's a UN Security Council resolution. If you've got China, US, Russia, NATO, and they all agree, they can make a condemnation, and it results in a minus 0.25 victory point loss on the target. You can also expand the membership of the UN Security Council. If the other members of the council agree, then, for example, India could be brought in as a member of the Security Council. And for India, there are victory point benefits for this. But to do this, you have to have nuclear weapons. So it can't be a minor state brought into the process. Again, here's some generic penalties that were also mentioned earlier. And you can the Security Council can also pass resolutions that can condemn a particular state. 2 states can be created. There's Tibet and Waziristan, and they take on some of the characteristics of other minor states. Again, there are some countries have incentives to do so. These states can be set up either voluntarily by China, or they can be physically imposed once other countries occupy the territory, and they can then, when they leave the territory, they can declare that the prospective minor state is set up. This is a chart I use to keep track of the accumulation of foreign aid points. They're specified as a proportion of a point accumulated every turn on the state's power card. But this is how it's aggregated for the referee in the game, so they can keep track of how many points there are and what turn an attempt is made to influence a minor state to become an ally. So a very large component of the simulation is the economic model. Countries can get a lot of victory points from having beneficial trade. Essentially, the trade system gives points to a country for maximizing its exports. So the Americans have a strong incentive to export as much as they can to China, and China has a strong incentive to export as much as it can to the US. And when there is a deficit, when states fail to export all of their export points, they get fewer victory points. On the other hand, countries want to minimize the number of imports that go into their territory, although there are exceptions. All countries like to import unlimited oil and unlimited valuable resources, such as minerals, which are indicated by the letter R. R are mineral oil states like Russia. States like to import or be able to import things like titanium, which has a great many high-end tech uses. So in order to make that model operate, what I've done is I've distinguished between different categories of trade goods, and I've specified the size of the economy and the amount of oil that's imported and exported for the particular country. And these values go into operating the system. So I'm going to give a quick briefing of how the economic structure works, and then I'm going to show you the charts that support it. So states can provide economic incentives or disincentives, including foreign aid, preferential trade access, preferential oil prices, or embargoes. These are different from the economic system, but they're noted on the cards. So countries can essentially embargo each other in terms of oil. But this is different from the economic system. It's also different from the oil system. All of these interactions would have to be written down and given to the referee. Once they're submitted, they can't be changed, but they can be conditional. So a country can say, we're embargoing unless no economic blockade ever occurs. So states obtain victory points for securing markets for their exports, and they can discount negative victory points by selecting an appropriate mix of imports. So a country can receive a certain amount of imports without negatives. If they receive beyond a certain amount, then they suffer negatives. A market does not want to be saturated by dumped goods from other states. So the optimal state importation profile is detailed for each state on the chart, and it follows the philosophy of product cycle levels. So a state's trade is classified according to the level of its product cycle. A is for advanced industrialization. B is for middle income manufacturer. C is for emerging manufacturer or integrated commodity exporter. D is for underdeveloped commodity exporter. E is for oil exporter. And R is for crucial commodity exporter. Some oil producing states have non-oil exporting residual economies as well. Each state has an optimal economic requirement for imports detailed in its description. For every preferred importation point, the minus 0.5 victory point associated with a single preferential trade arrangement is eliminated. And this is all calculated automatically by an Excel file. E or R type product cycles states can substitute for any import requirement, A, B, or C. Excess importation points bring no discount unless they're from an E or R type product cycle economy. A state may not trade with a state that has been conquered or suffered catastrophic loss or collapse. Well, that's not strictly true. If the state has suffered catastrophic loss, you have 50% trade. Preferential trade access yields an additional 10% value of the preferential trade victory point per level. It is below the product cycle value of the importing state. So if you import less, other than countries that are E or R, then you get more victory points. So you want to always minimize your imports and maximize your exports. So the trade chart identifies the state, which is also identified on the state card. It identifies the amount of exports the state has that it needs to export to a market, the type, and you locate the state on the left-hand column in the trade chart. And then the columns are basically extended from left to right to indicate all the states that can be traded with. There's no limits. All states can trade with all other states as long as they can find some oceanic outlet and they can trace a hypothetical trade path to that target state. The final trade calculation is basically 40 times the total trade divided by the total export potential. And so all countries have the same range of possible victory points, so it's sort of standardized or normalized for all the states. In theory, this is for every 26 turns, which is the extent of 1 year, although no simulation I've ever run has ever run that far. It normally comes to conclusion somewhat earlier. So this is the chart for 2013. You can see China's GDP is about 7 trillion or 7,000 billion, and the U.S. is at 15 trillion. Here you can see the economies of some of the minor states. This is a very long chart. Couldn't be represented here, so I just showed the first 10 or 15. You can see Afghanistan. It's got a $17 billion economy. That means it can import 1 value point. It can export 1, and it's got a type D. All right, it's got 0 oil exportation as measured by billion barrels per day. And what it does import, it did import from Iran. So that's important because all states need to get oil from somewhere, and minor states will automatically import oil from a larger state, although it doesn't expend anything because it's a residually small amount of oil, but they still need to identify where they're getting their oil from. This is the economy in 2016. China's at 10 trillion. The U.S. is at 17 trillion, and other countries have been adjusted as well. This is all from the military balance from the IISS. Again, these are the minor countries represented, showing the rise in their economies. This is the oil chart. So what you have here on the left-hand column is the list of countries that export oil and how many points they have to export. And on the top row, you can see the importers and how many they need to import. And if there's a deficit, there are victory point consequences that are specified on the generic victory point loss. So, for example, a Singapore needs to import 1, NATO needs to import 8, Japan needs to import 4. So this is just sort of a sample of some of the countries that need to import. Many countries are self-sufficient, so they don't need to import points at all. Countries like Indonesia, so they're not listed in the top row. So you can see here that Saudi Arabia has a total export capacity of 14. It exports 1 to China, 2 to the US, 2 to NATO, 2 to Japan, 1 to India, 1 to South Korea, 1 to Taiwan, 1 to Pakistan, 1 to Singapore, and 1 to Thailand. If there would be an embargo, or Saudi Arabia would cut off oil, or there'd be a naval blockade, then obviously there are significant consequences that follow from that. And you can see many countries that are not represented on the map, such as Brazil or Colombia. Getting oil from a minor country that's not committed is on a first-come, first-served basis. So in this particular simulation, the U.S. imports the 1 Brazilian oil point from Brazil, and the Americans import 2 of the points from Venezuela. Although Venezuela, the status can be changed by converting it into a power friendly to another state, and then you have control over its oil, and you can stop it from trading with the U.S. So the total import and export results in the total production on top. I use that sort of as a guide. You can see here the nominal suppliers and the nominal recipients, which are mostly minor countries. North Korea gets their oil from China. North Korea is an actually played country. Indonesia provides oil to Myanmar and Vietnam, and those 2 countries are played. The Philippines is not. And so there are relationships there that can be cut off. Indonesia can cut off the Philippines from oil if they wanted to, although Philippines is a minor country, it wouldn't have much of an effect. So these relationships are important. So this is the overall trade chart as represented in Excel. It's impossible to read. This is us zooming in a bit. And what you can see in the left-hand side is a victory point column. In the black block is how it's calculated. And it lists all of the major played states and all of the minor states. It lists their export capacity, which is how many points have to be exported. It tells the product cycle. So China, for example, is a C. And on the top row, here it's not shown. We're going to get to another slide. It'll show the different countries, and it shows you how much of each different kind of material they can import. So countries are set up to absorb different kinds of imports on the product cycle, A, B, C, or D, or E, or R, but they can only export one kind. So students don't have to write down on this card the letter. They only have to write down the number, because if America is exporting, the Americans can only export A products. So you wouldn't say 110A, you would say 10A. So here you can see it in more detail. You can see China in the top middle of the top row. China has a maximum discount of 87 for A, a maximum of 43 for B, and so A countries can export to China a maximum of 87 and a maximum of 43, and if they exceed that, China's going to start suffering significant negatives. Ideally, China would import nothing, and China would export everything. China has an export of 189, which you can see on the right side. So a significant activity of the foreign minister will be contacting other countries to obtain permission for China to export to them. Now, in the free market world, of course, governments don't manage imports and exports, but this is really sort of as a surrogate for how the tariff structures are designed to discourage or encourage countries to trade. So this is a attempt to capture the Chinese government trying to get tariffs reduced so it can get its exports, all 189 points worth, into foreign markets reliably. And every country's got the same challenge. So this is an important component of the system because you have a huge growing economy, and you want to be able to capture the security aspect balanced in with the economic. And many states are going to get more victory points from running a healthy economy in a difficult environment than conquering territory. So here you can see the chart filled out. This is one scenario. You can run different scenarios. China could try to diversify its economy. China could trade with the big powers and play nice and adapt to the American conception of reality. Countries can form trade blocs where they trade with each other and they try to isolate third parties that they have major policy disagreements with. Countries like China and Japan who don't like each other very often find themselves trading with each other. The North Koreans might have difficulty finding someone to trade with. Even though, frankly, their economy is so small, it should be easy to find an export market. Taiwan is an equally serious problem. China may not want to trade with them. So it's complex, and the possible permutations are fantastic. The large powers control the trade behavior of the minor powers that are allied to them. This is the chart that I pass around the room. If a major country trades with a minor country, they don't put it on the chart. They put it on a separate piece of paper, and I input it after the simulation. And it really only takes about 10 minutes to generate the victory points. It's quite a fast calculation process I have set up in the Excel file. The formula just spew out the answer. So this is the general mission card that each of the players are provided with. It's got the role of the player, where the military forces are deployed, the nuclear weapons, the foreign aid point totals, the economic characteristics of the state, what its export capacity is, its import capacity, the oil production, where it exports to, where it imports to, and of course generic victory point awards. So let's take a look at some of these. This is China. These are the assets: 69 cities, 17 oil fields, 12 mines, 140 hexes. Gives the positions of the different members of the country, gives the indicators. This I have since updated this, so it says here total economy 7,000. That's actually not technically true. This would be 2013. I have it up to 2016 now, although this card is peculiarly old. So China exports 189 category C. It's got foreign aid, military aid. It's got the oil consumption of 9, oil production, oil importation, and with the list of suppliers and who it exports the oil to, nominally to North Korea and Nepal, and its excess oil. There are conditional events, such as independent Uyghurastan, and the effect it has, which would reduce China's oil production to 2 million. It's got the allies. It's got the initial military forces. It's got the nuclear assets listed by brigade, base, hex, the type of weapon. Before the slash is the number of warheads, and the number after the slash is the range in hexes. You've got ballistic missile submarines under SSBN, the nuclear bombers, and it's got a whole list of the victory point bonuses, the river dams, and the penalties. So just, looking at these, abolishing discrimination against the Chinese in Indonesia is worth 10 victory points to the Chinese. So they, of course, want to push Indonesia on that. The sale of nuclear weapons to Saudi Arabia is worth 10 victory points. If Japan initiates nuclear weapons, it's a minus 20 victory points, but that can be mitigated to a minus 10 because China could provide nuclear weapons to Japan, creating some dependency, and the victory point penalty would be much less. If Australia initiates a nuclear weapons program, it's a minus 5 victory points. If Taiwan declares independence, it's a minus 30 victory points. China would like to get the northeast frontier area back. That would be worth 5 victory points. So this is a very complex list of incentives and desires and goals, and the Chinese player has to figure out which path is the safest to follow. Here you can see the American mission card. The Americans are very averse to nuclear war. If any nuclear weapon is detonated, there's a minus 20 victory points. They also don't want Japan, South Korea, or Australia to build nuclear weapons. And they suffer also the generic victory point bonuses and penalties that were listed earlier. America's got a fairly robust nuclear complex. Most of their military forces, conventional, while they do have a powerful navy, are dispersed, and they have to concentrate them in the event of a crisis. Here you can see India, 29 cities, 3 oil fields. It's got the Arahant ballistic missile submarine, which is fairly limited. It's only got a 3 hex range. The dams that India can build and the impact it has on Pakistan, as well as the penalties it can suffer in India from Chinese developments and the military forces. Here's Iran, the different goals it would like. It would like to have an allied Iraq, for example. And it can purchase nuclear weapons. It's got a special purpose fund, and it can actually then physically get nuclear weapons. Any nuclear weapon trade in the simulation is handled on a 2-to-1 scale. So if say China were to provide nuclear weapons to Iran, for every missile Iran would receive, China would have to erase 2 of its from its own arsenal. Here you can see Russia. It's got a fairly substantial nuclear infrastructure, including road mobile systems, rail mobile systems. It's got its ballistic missile submarines, the Delta class. It's obviously has certain goals. It certainly does not want China to occupy the Balkans region or Mongolia. It doesn't want Japan to get have a nuclear program. So all this is specified. Russian forces, of course, quite thin on the ground. They're dispersed, and many of the forces have to be relocated from Europe to the Far East if China would become more adventurous on the Russian frontier. This is the mission card for Indonesia. Minus 15 victory points if those are repeal of legal restrictions on the Chinese population. In fact, this has happened, but I left it here because it's more a question of profound changes to the way that Indonesia treats the Chinese community. Here's the NATO card. Of course, NATO's got a huge incentive in the democratization of China, which is a big impact on the simulation. And these are minor states. They're specified in terms of their total economy, their import capacity, their export capacity, oil importation, their military forces, and their collapse and catastrophic loss value. So there are 5 scenarios that are played in the simulation. The first is a free play learning scenario. The second one is a Taiwan scenario where the Chinese get 500% victory points for any foreign conquests. And Taiwan is worth so much, there's a strong incentive for China to move against Taiwan, and then against the Ryukyu chain, and then to establish their first island chain, and then their second island chain, and to secure the South China Sea. This is the third scenario, set in 2035. This is a part of the scenario. The scenario's got quite an extensive list of notes. Here I run a flat nuclear war, and I give significant incentives for a surprise nuclear attack, a +2 modifier. The Chinese are much more sophisticated by 2035. I give sort of examples here of how to write counterforce and countervalue orders. The American arsenal is pretty much the same. The Russian arsenal has sunk, but it's modernized. So you can see the Bori ballistic missile submarines there at the bottom with Bulava sea-launched ballistic missiles. And of course, you've got Japan's arsenal. North Korea's got a more sophisticated arsenal. South Korea. So this is really looking at the difficulties in East Asia of having medium to advanced nuclear arsenals overlapping each other in a region where you've got cross-cutting cleavages. In other words, you don't have 2 factions. It's not a pro-China faction and an anti-China faction. It's a lot more complicated than that, where China's allied to countries that mutually don't like each other, like Iran and Saudi Arabia. And so it shows you how difficult it is to conduct diplomacy with these nuclear weapons present. So you've got, for example, the Japanese arsenal is quite strong. They've got their mobile IRBMs in Hokkaido, the Amaterasu Omikami. They've got their Hachiman on their Nowo ballistic missile submarines, their Raiden cruise missiles that operate from their naval ships, and cruise missiles from their bombers. And you've got this much more sophisticated force for the North Koreans and the South Koreans. This, of course, is past nuclear arsenals. There are other countries listed, India and Pakistan, that are also provided with significantly beefed up arsenals. There's a fourth scenario, which is a Russia-China war, in which China has huge incentives for the conquest of Siberia. So they get a 500% incentive for any conquests done in the Russian Far East. This conflict prohibits Russia and China from using any counter-value nuclear weapons. So they cannot nuke each other's cities unless China crosses the Irtysh River, which is sort of the barrier between the Russian Far East and Russian Central Asia and the approach to the Urals. So this is, certainly a source of paranoia for some Russian leaders. The conventional academic wisdom is that there's very little threat of this, but I've observed that countries change their interests dramatically and quickly when they have sudden power shifts. So countries might have the appetite to change their interests and then claim they were dormant. And there's the final scenario, scenario 5, which is China 2080, and this has significant economic and military changes because it's speculated that the demographic impacts, the demographic effects of a smaller workforce and fewer children in China is going to multiply in the future. In 2012, China's labor force began to shrink, and this is at the time when India's labor force is still growing. India's got a much younger population, so we're going to see shifts. Economic shifts, strategic shifts, and demographic shifts that have impacts on the size of armies. So China, India, Pakistan, Japan, North and South Korea can conduct tactical nuclear warfare. So it's a big change from 2035 in the contemporary scenario. You can see the Americans are basically holding strong. The Russians have shrunk even further as far as their nuclear arsenal. The Chinese nuclear arsenal is stronger than the American nuclear arsenal. They've got 10 Jin ballistic submarines, which match the Americans. These are the new counters. You'll see a much smaller Chinese army and a much stronger Chinese navy. You're going to see that the Indians will match the Chinese army. So here you have China with multiple threats, an aging population, outnumbered at this point by India's population. India is going to be sophisticated, or it's going to be able to deploy sophisticated systems in its army, even though its navy is going to be smaller because its economy is going to be a lot smaller. Pakistan and Indonesia will also be better organized. North Korea and South Korea will also shrink over time. They have serious demographic issues along with Japan, and so their militaries will become more sophisticated and smaller, where Japan is just going to get smaller, basically. And Myanmar is also going to be slightly better organized in 2080 than it is now. Other states remain the same. So this is the oil situation in 2080. So I made some sort of rough judgment calls as to what I expect to be some of the changes. And this is this here hasn't changed from the contemporary scenario. So this is the new economic basis for the new Excel file to calculate trade. Here, China's economy is 30 trillion and the U.S. is 22 trillion. So China's about a third wealthier than the U.S. The Russians are still as back as they used to be. NATO's up to 20 trillion. India is up to 9 trillion. So it's hugely wealthier than it was before, but it's less than a third of China. So it's got a long way to go. That growth in economy was significant. You can see Japan hanging in at 7 trillion and South Korea's gone up. So major economic shifts, major demographic shifts, and it sort of all balances out to make China weaker. So China's faced with a sort of a closing window of opportunity. 2080 shows China in an environment where it can no longer make a huge strategic difference in East Asia. It simply doesn't have the muscle to be able to take on even a partial constellation of allies on its frontiers. It couldn't survive a war in which it was fighting both India, the U.S., and Russia, or India and the U.S. and Japan. Wouldn't have the capacity. So it's to highlight the future, and it raises questions about how the Chinese see the medium term before the 2080 limitations on its ability to assert itself in the region take effect. Here is the changes applied to the minor countries again. This is sort of just a bookkeeping thing. Here's the new chart. So China has an export capacity now of 500. So it's wealthier, but it needs markets. And so to get full victory points in a much richer Chinese economy, it's got even stronger incentives to trade with the U.S. And to trade with the European Union, or what I have here, Europe represented as NATO. Okay, so how are the victors determined? Um, this simulation uses the Monte Carlo system, and so players are judged not by how many victory points they accumulate versus other players of other countries in the same game. No, the way it's calculated is we compare the victory points the player has now to previous plays by players of the same country. And so you're really playing against, if you're leading a particular country, you're playing against previous leaders of that same country. And the way we calculate that is we take the average of the previous values and we compare it to the victory points of the current player. Now, obviously, there's a problem with that because here we have very different scenarios, and the scenarios are not played evenly. Although about half of the games are free play, so students are allowed to do whatever the heck they want. And you can see here color-coded states that collapsed or were conquered or had catastrophes. And nuclear war happens sometimes, but very often nuclear war doesn't happen, and states are basically left fighting each other for economic influence. Now, what I want to do is cover some of the more detailed rules so that this briefing will be useful to the players. Okay, so some additional rules that I've not touched on so far include, right, we covered the ground-based air rule. We covered the danger of coastal operations. For every hex that a stack of ships moves through that it's hostile to it, they can be subject to an attack of 1 by whoever owns that coast. Naval units have integral marines, and so naval ships can occupy and take over for the country that owns them. That fleet can take over single hex islands and atolls by spending a single turn in that hex. So they would go to the hex and just stop there, and they would not be attacked from the shore. They would have to be attacked from the shore, and if they survive, they can then seize the territory. So you don't need to have ground forces to capture all the small islands in the Pacific. That would be sort of overkill. You just have a fleet going around and picking up the different targets, and or rather landing on the different islands, and then essentially converting them to possession by the state. And all of these would sort of be written down by the player and handed on a piece of paper to the referee. Now, we spoke before about sea transportation. It's got to be picked up in a city on a coast and moved to another location. We spoke about contiguous hexes for blockades. Some countries that naturally have straits within them that are used by other states to trade, like Indonesia, Oman, and Iran, they can have a significant impact simply by declaring a blockade. They don't need a naval craft, just because the straits pass through their territories and they can close those territories. So you can imagine Indonesia, Malaysia, and Australia, if they're somehow allied, they can block trade completely from the Persian Gulf. And it would oblige China to take a naval unit with an army unit and land an amphibious attack somewhere in order to capture the territory to forcibly open up those minor states. So there's, we talked about ethnic agitation up to -10. We spoke about nuclear weapons and how they're to be used, and the 2-to-1 effect for trading of nuclear weapons. So for democratic nuclear war, democracies such as US, NATO, and Australia may only conduct a counterforce nuclear strike on a target state. In other words, the U.S. could preemptively attack China's nuclear forces at any time, but these countries, these democracies, may not do counter-value nuclear strikes. They cannot attack cities, either against the state itself or its allies or any allied minor state. Now, there are no restrictions once these states have themselves been hit by a counter-value nuclear strike. So if China nukes an American city, then America has no restrictions placed upon it for the use of its own weapons. Now, whenever a counterforce attack hits a base, not a silo system, but a base, it destroys 1d10 missiles. And that's to represent that bases have missiles that are concentrated in a very vulnerable way. And so, of course, it's not a recommended setup if a country wants to protect its nuclear weapons. So that essentially covers 90% of the rules necessary to play the sim. Ultimately, the output of the sim for the students is to, of course, familiarize themselves with the geography, the strategic areas of interest, the particular countries and their militaries, their naval strengths, their economic goals, the infrastructure to do with rivers and dams, the ethnic agitation issues, the impact of nuclear weapons, and of course, more broadly and more theoretically, the difficulty of making decisions as an executive, balancing military versus economic and diplomatic strategies, the need to package and communicate complex information efficiently to the executive as sort of a dynamic of domestic politics, and more as an emergent value, watching the simulation as it leads to the creation of coalitions, and ultimately the reward that is given to highly intelligent policy entrepreneurs. The idea that success comes from sort of a successful Bismarck personality who can weave together other personalities and complicated ideas and challenges to achieve their goal.